Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 34D, an interview on Ike, the Last General, with Colonel Bryan Gibby. I'm excited to welcome Colonel Bryan Gibby to the show today. Bryan is the deputy head of the History Department at West Point. He is also a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces, and I greatly appreciate his time, as today we're going to talk about the last president to attend West Point and the last general to reach the presidency, Dwight Eisenhower, and how Ike's time at the Academy, in the Army, and during World War II shaped his leadership style and impacted his presidential administration. Thank you for your time, Bryan. Thank you for your service, and welcome to the show.
Kenny, thank you very much. This is it's my honor and privilege to be on the show with you. I'm very excited to talk about General Eisenhower and President Eisenhower.
Me too. And let's start. I'd love to start by asking, does Ike ever come up in your lectures? And if so, how does he resonate with today's cadets?
Yeah, we do spend a good amount of time on President Eisenhower. We have 2 courses in military history that all cadets have to take. The first is called the Army of the Republic, Leading Citizen Soldiers. And this is a core course that all the plebes, or what they're called freshmen in other institutions, they all have to take it in the fall of their plebe year. And it's a history of the United States Army. And when we get to the second half of the course, we're into the 20th century, where, of course, General Eisenhower is a very significant figure. And we talk about the Second World War for a couple lessons, and we get into the early part of the Cold War also for 1 or 2 lessons. So we get to talk about his leadership and his presidency in a very broad. It's a survey course, so in a very broad way. The course where he gets a little bit better attention is in the history of the military art of the 20th century, which is an upper class course. So those are mostly juniors and seniors. And there we spend a substantial amount of time on World War II and time on the interwar period as well, between World War I and World War II, where Eisenhower is kind of cutting his teeth. And so he gets more attention. And I think for cadets, it does resonate because General Eisenhower is one of the 5 individuals that have a statue on what we call the plain, and the plain is the parade ground at West Point. So it's right out in front. All cadets, every time cadets go to class, they walk by Eisenhower's statue. So they're certainly aware of who he is and that he was an Academy graduate. And if they pause at the statue and actually look at the inscription, they'll see that he was a president. They'll see that he had 5 stars. For some of them that might be new information. But then when they go into their history classes, and they learn about what he did as the Supreme Commander, which for us, as West Point alumni and instructors, we're really proud of that because we don't win the war without him. He's that essential to the narrative of the Second World War. And then what he does as a president, being the first president to go into office with the Cold War already in progress. For the 20-somethings, who are worried about their day-to-day lives, to then expose him to somebody who has literally the weight of the world, on his shoulders in fighting a global war, and then the Cold War, I think it's really impressive for them.
Awesome. Thanks. And now, we talk about Ike being this great leader, and there are many ways to be a leader. You can be a shouter, an inspirer, a collaborator. There's many ways to skin that cat. What was Ike's leadership style like?
I think I would characterize it more like a leader by consensus. And what I mean by that is he did a lot to inspire people around him to want to pull, to get everyone pulling for the common goal. He was very effective at that. And we really see this when he's first appointed to be the commander of Operation Torch in 1942, where it's just kind of ironic. An officer who has never heard a shot fired in anger,
right,
is now the commander of what up to that point is going to be the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted,
And this is
in
the
history.
invasion of Northwest Africa.
Right, exactly. Yeah, Operation Torch, Northwest Africa. And he has as his subordinates mainly British officers who have been fighting the Germans now for over 2 years, and have reached the pinnacle of their profession because they were at World War One. They have all this
Mhm.
combat experience,
Yeah.
and he's in charge, of them. And so he had to, find ways to get them all pulling together. And there's national rivalries, British and
Right.
American,
Yeah.
and then the French get involved,
Yeah.
eventually. So you got a three-way. You have service rivalries. The Army doesn't
Right.
like the Navy
Yeah.
doesn't like the Air Force,
Yeah.
and you got to get all them together. And then it's American Army and British Navy. There's all sorts of ways that this operation could have gone sour. But Eisenhower manages to keep it all together, and he really does this by consensus. And I think that that's critically important, that he was confident that everybody understood the plan, accepted the plan, and was going to execute the plan to the best of their ability. And he was just really good at that kind of leadership. And that extends all the way into his presidency.
And there's a phrase out there, natural born leader. Some people, maybe they were always the tallest, the strongest, the fastest, the funniest. For whatever reason, they were looked to as leaders from a young age. Was Ike a natural leader, or was this something he learned from experience over life?
I think Ike had some qualities for sure that attracted people to him. People they liked Ike, and that's the famous slogan from his presidential campaign. I like Ike. He was a very likable person. I think that he had a calming influence when people are going crazy because the plan's going wrong, or they're not getting their way. His presence, his influence tended to reassure people that things were going to turn out okay. That doesn't mean that he didn't have a temper. He did. He was quite a famous. If you made him angry, he would let you know, and you would see it. His face would turn red, his veins would bulge, right? But you really had to push him hard to get to
Yeah,
to
yeah.
get to that point, right? So he had a tremendous amount of patience, and and confidence in the principles that he believed in, and just had great character. People wanted to work with him,
Mm-hmm.
even people who didn't like him.
Hmm.
You know, Montgomery, the British general Montgomery,
Sure.
Bernard
Yeah.
Montgomery, certainly had conflicts with Ike. George Patton,
Yep.
certainly has conflicts with Ike. But they never said, I'm not doing it. I'm not working
Mm-hmm.
for him. He had a way of bringing them along, which is a tremendous leadership accomplishment, right?
Yeah.
Now, he certainly does learn. So those are his natural characteristics, and then he certainly
Yeah.
does learn as an officer. He graduates from West Point in 1915. He doesn't go to World War One. He has various staff jobs and the like. But he has his experiences, in particular as a lieutenant with the National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
So very early in his career, he's assigned to a National Guard brigade, and he's thrown into the kind of unit that most regular Army officers of the time period would have done anything to stay away from. This
Right.
was like a poison pill. Right?
Yeah.
But he's a lieutenant. He doesn't know any better, and he's a nice guy, right? Or people perceive that he's a nice guy, and
Mm.
he gets tremendous experience working with citizen soldiers and other kinds of different kinds of officers that he's going to end up leading 20 years
Mm.
later.
Yeah.
And this is really fascinating, from lieutenant to lieutenant general within, roughly about 20 years, 23 years or so. And so now he's leading, leading these people. And so I think that's really his natural qualities, but also he did learn a lot of leadership lessons as he grew up in the Army.
And we talk about his learning experiences. Certainly a formative experience was his time as a cadet, aka a student at West Point. In addition to working at the history department at West Point, you were once a cadet. You kind of hinted at that earlier.
That's true.
What does West Point teach its men and women about leadership, and how does it teach leadership there?
So it's an interesting question in the context of talking about Eisenhower and what I just explained, because West Point has not always taught leadership in the same way, and it's really important in the early 20th century to understand that at West Point the philosophy of leader development was much different than it is today.
Yeah.
So back then it was basically sink or swim. You either have what it takes or you don't.
Yeah.
And you're going to come to West Point, and we're gonna make this so hard. The 4 years you're going to spend here are so grueling and so refining that if you survive and graduate, you must be a great leader. That was kind of the philosophy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if somehow you lack character or you lack toughness or you just couldn't handle it, then you washed out and you left, and everyone was happy for that. After World War II, kind of coincidentally, Eisenhower tells the academy, you need to teach human psychology.
Oh, interesting.
Yes. And he wanted psychology taught at West Point in the context of leader development. Because I presume he saw a lot of leadership in the war, some of it good, some of it not so good.
Yeah.
And he understood that you have to understand men today, men and women. You got to understand what makes people tick.
Yeah.
How do you motivate them to do things that are very unnatural?
Yeah.
Right? So he was the one who pressed that. And eventually, after about 20 years, in the early 1970s, I believe the Department of Behavioral Science and Leadership was formed at West Point. And that faculty really did a lot to create a program. So before it was kind of like just dumb luck. We brought you in, and somehow you were just so stubborn, you made it, and therefore you must be a great leader.
Yeah.
To now, West Point, starting in the 70s, is now taking a deliberate approach to leader development. And it's got to the point today where we have basically three things that we want all leaders to get. We want you to live honorably, lead honorably, and demonstrate excellence. Those are the three. Those are kind of the three outcomes of leader development. And West Point goes through a very deliberate process of academic education, military training, the discipline that you live under, the disciplined regime that you live under for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 4 years. That in our experience, and we're constantly assessing this, right? But in our experience, that we develop you. So now instead of an attritional model, of you make it or you don't, now it's a developmental model where you come to West Point as a cadet. You're here for a reason.
Right.
West Point saw something in you, some potential, and now we're going to refine that and develop it and build you up, so that when you graduate, you are a leader of character. But that's not to say that there isn't attrition. If you demonstrate that intellectually, morally, character-wise, physically, you can't handle it, then certainly separation from the academy is there.
Yeah.
But it's a very deliberative process.
Thanks for explaining that. And that's so fascinating, the role Eisenhower played in how West Point changes how it teaches leadership.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Okay, so if we get back to Eisenhower and we jump forward from his cadet years, and we jump past the interwar years, we get to 27 years after he graduated West Point. Ike was made the supreme commander in North Africa, as we were talking about, Operation Torch, and then Europe during World War II, where he had to lead a vast multinational force. You talked to some of this earlier, but can we get deeper in this? What were the challenges of that task, and how did he succeed?
Yeah, monumental challenges that I don't think Eisenhower really had much, much of a foretaste of just how difficult this was going to be. General George C. Marshall sends Eisenhower to England in the summer of 1942, along with another officer named Mark Clark, who was also a West Point graduate.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells Eisenhower, "Hey, go to England and figure out why the British don't want to invade France in 1942."
Yeah.
Which, the British have been telling Marshall and President Roosevelt, all these issues, and they're right. They're not ready to go back.
Yeah.
They just got kicked off, in 1940.
Yeah.
And so Eisenhower's like, Roger, Roger is the Army phrase for I understand, I get it, I'll do it. So Roger, sir, I'll go. And Eisenhower goes, and he quickly finds out, the British are kind of right. There's a lot of issues. So first of all, what we today call power projection.
Sure.
How do you take the army that the United States is going to make, 8 million soldiers, and how do you move it to wherever it is that you want to go? In this case, you got to move to England, and then you got to move it to France. So where are the ships? There's a funny story that Eisenhower tells about, when I die, I want to get buried in an LST. And an LST stands for a landing ship tank.
Yeah.
Because for the next 3 years, that's all he's going to think about are LSTs. Where are they? And why won't the Navy build more? Okay. Because the Navy wants to build aircraft carriers, battleships, and submarines.
Right.
The Army wants the Navy to build LSTs.
Yes.
Because unless you have LSTs, you can't go anywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So power projection. How are we going to get all these troops into the fight? Logistics. It's great that I have millions of soldiers ready to fight, but if I don't have tens of millions of rations,
Right.
hundreds of tens of millions of gallons of gas, ammunition, trucks, it's not going to matter. I have to be able to sustain whatever force I project, whatever power I project to North Africa or to Italy or to France or wherever. I have to be able to sustain it. And then I got my British allies, who have a very different, a different culture, different experience with fighting. I've got the French, who also bring a very different culture and experience of fighting. And then I got the Germans. The Germans are not just going to let me do what I want to do. I have to. So Eisenhower's got to kind of triangulate, all of these people. And then it's leadership. Who's going to command? And who are going to be Eisenhower's principal deputies?
Yeah.
Who's going to be in charge of the air war and the naval forces and the ground forces, and all of that. All of these issues take time to identify, and B, then resolve. Right. So time is another challenge that he's got. So how does he kind of deal with all of this? Eisenhower's he's I would call him a people person.
Yeah.
He liked engaging personally with others. He spent countless hours with Winston Churchill, and Churchill would just go on and on and on and on. A meeting for Churchill starts at 8:00, and Eisenhower is like, "Okay, that's great. I can wake up at 6. I can have breakfast. I can shoot around a golf."
Yeah.
And oh no, sir, we've been 8 at night.
Yeah.
Right, 8 at night. You'll have dinner with Winston, with the prime minister, right?
Yeah.
And that'll last until about 10:00, and then you'll smoke cigars until about 11:00 at night, and then the map boards will come out, and then the briefing will start, right? The meeting starts at 11 p.m.
Yeah.
and will last until 2 a.m. or 3 a.m.
Oh my
right?
goodness.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so very quickly Eisenhower's like, "Oh, this is horrible," but he knows that he has to do this because if he can get Churchill to see his point of view, that helps solve a lot of problems.
Yeah.
He does this with everybody, right? So this is critically important. Detailed planning. Another one of his favorite aphorisms was, "Plans are useless, but planning is essential."
Huh.
And so what he meant by that is when you have the plan and you go into action against the enemy, it's you throw it out because everything changes, right?
Yeah.
But the details, and the detailed discussions, and the coordination and the troubleshooting that you go through to make a plan is what's going to save the day, because that gives you flexibility.
Yeah.
And the ability to improvise, right? Maybe the tanks, the tanks are over on this beach on the left, and you really need them over on the right. But at least they're on the beach that's on the left. They're not in South Carolina or something, because you planned for that, right?
Yeah.
And so he gets into details.
Yeah.
And he does this as a president too. I think he gets an unfair reputation as being this kind of chairman of the board, hands off. I'm going to go play golf. A lot of that is from his political opponents, both Republicans and Democrats, particularly the Kennedy administration, who tried to, contrast this youthful, vigorous John F. Kennedy with this older, I only have time to play golf. But in fact, Eisenhower is he's in details.
Yeah.
And he does that in his presidency. When Gary Powers is shot down in the U-2 over the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Eisenhower takes responsibility for that, because he was involved in setting that program up, which is really, really strange. That you would think the CIA kind of does their own thing, but he knew he knew where the plane was going to be. He knew what the risks were. He knew what the program was about. He was into those details. Well, he does the same thing in the Second World War, and I think the advantage that it gives to him is you can't BS him, right? You can't BS him. Sell him a line of bovine excrement. Patton tries to do that a lot, and tries to kind of give him a hand wave of we need to do this, and then Eisenhower would say to Patton, Georgie, you only have 50,000 gallons of gas. How are you going to get across the Rhine River?
Yeah.
And then Georgie would get all mad, right? But he was right. Eisenhower knew the details.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, knowing the details and being involved and having these personal relationships went a long way to tackling, all these problems that we were talking about.
You mentioned a lot of the challenges that were made up here, the logistics, the details of all these things. What was like superpower as a military leader? If he had one, was it just he's great at reading weather reports before D-Day? What were his strengths and what were his weaknesses?
You're going to find this answer funny. Eisenhower was a great poker player. And I'm not making this up. When he was a cadet at West Point, gambling was prohibited, right? But cadets gambled. They played cards anyway, and they would they'd keep a ledger of Joe owes me 5, I owe bet Jim 10, and at the end of the 4 years, Eisenhower is collecting money from everybody. Okay, he was great at poker. He could read people. Mm-hmm. He knew when he was being bluffed. Mm-hmm. And knowing he's being bluffed, he could bluff in return, and he was an excellent bluffer if he had to be.
How interesting. Yeah.
He also knew when he was holding, the royal flush.
Yeah.
And you were holding a pair of deuces.
Yeah.
Right? But he would make you think that you were holding, the high cards until he needed to really put the wood down and have his way. So he was really good at reading people, and I guess you could say it's kind of manipulative.
It's influencing, which is manipulative.
It's influencing, right?
Yeah.
But he was very careful not to. He wouldn't take advantage of people for his own personal gain. Yeah. It really was about how do I manage a difficult person to get them to pull their weight for the common good.
Yeah.
But he's and this comes in handy, throughout his life. Yeah. He loved military history, and because of his study of military history, he understood strategy and the application of force. And I think he understood this in ways that for others they kind of looked on the surface. but he understood that beneath the power projection, for example, there's the logistics, and if you don't solve the logistics problem, guys like Douglas MacArthur, you can draw arrows on a map all day long, and it's great, it's bold, it's brilliant, but if you don't have the logistics behind it, it's worthless.
Yeah.
And he was very good at understanding kind of the underlying problems of strategy that you need, the non-sexy parts that you need to figure out before you launch an invasion. And I mentioned before the planning, the detailed planning.
Yeah. Right.
I think it was his characteristic to leave nothing to chance. And kind of a corollary to that was to take no unnecessary risks. And this kind of makes him vulnerable to some criticism, especially after the war. He gets taken to task by Patton, for one, Montgomery, and some other British officers that, Eisenhower was too conservative. He should have launched, the narrow thrust to capture Berlin.
Right.
And, and Eisenhower's position was, okay, well, hold on a second. Since when, in all of our experience, have the Germans panicked? Right? The Germans are surprised frequently, but they never panic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, a lot of this, you need to take a risk was predicated on an assumption that the Germans would be so surprised they would panic and not respond ineffectively.
Right.
And
right.
Eisenhower would say, I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, he's reading the poker player at the German army.
Right.
He says, those guys aren't going to fall for this. Yeah.
That's right. They're not going to fold, and they're going to ante up. And so he understands risk. And he understands that, for example, in 1944, when the argument is made that the Western Allies should make a drive to Berlin,
right?
Even in 1945, probably more so in 1945, that we could get to Berlin first, ahead of the Soviet Union, and then Eisenhower would say, okay, we could do that. 10,000 more Allied soldiers dead.
Mm-hmm.
And we made an agreement with the Soviets in January that they're going to have Berlin in their occupation zone.
Mm-hmm.
So, who wants to go sell this to your public?
Right.
10,000 more killed in action, so that we could, so that we could feel good about ourselves that we captured Berlin, and not the Soviets.
Right.
And I think that was a good call,
Yeah.
As president, he gets kind of put in a similar situation when it comes to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And I think his calculus is kind of the same of, okay, Vietnam, like Berlin, is a geographical objective. It's a territorial objective. I don't care about territory. I care about people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And and the evidence for this is Eisenhower's soldiers knew this. I think they instinctively knew that Eisenhower was not going to throw away their lives. He would put them at risk. He would ask them to do things that were risky.
Yeah.
People are going to die and get hurt, but it was not going to be unnecessary risk.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, so let's jump and let's advance from Eisenhower the general to the presidency.
Okay.
And my first curiosity is there anything he took from his military experience directly into how he ran his administration? For example, I think of how historians often point to George Washington's cabinet and say, oh, that kind of looks like a war council a general has. The presidential cabinet totally is something borrowed from the army. Is there anything in Ike's administration that you can similarly point to and say he brought this from his experience in the army?
Yeah, I think you can, and that would be as a supreme commander, as a very high level military commander, Eisenhower he needed to set a vision. What are we trying to do? What's our mission, right? And along with that vision, there would come expectations. This is what I want you to do, and this is what I want you to do, and then he would have to delegate. And essentially kind of let go of of the authority of the power and let subordinates, fulfill the expectations, right? But even so, the boss owns the decision. The buck
Right.
stops here.
Yeah.
Truman popularized that saying. And I think for Eisenhower, the president, it was the same thing. And I brought up the U-2 incident earlier.
Right.
It was this,
Right.
same thing. Eisenhower recognized that this was my, I own this, but I'm going to allow people, my subordinates, to do what they need to do. And I think largely, during his presidency, he did this. He operated on this principle. For example, in the when Eisenhower was a lieutenant, again going back into I think it was 1919, he's put in charge of a mission to drive coast to coast,
Right.
from Washington D.C. to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And what are the roads like in 1919? Well, the first day, I think in 3 hours they drove 40 miles, and that was and they had to stop.
Yeah.
So it takes weeks to travel across the country because the road network is just horrible.
Mm-hmm.
When Eisenhower is in Europe, he sees the German autobahns.
Sure.
And when he becomes president, he realizes, okay, logistics really important, transportation really important.
Yeah.
I have a vision that in the United States, it's not going to take weeks to move from one coast to the next.
Yeah.
We need an Autobahn style highway system in America, and that's the interstate system, which has a very peculiar rule that every 5 miles there has to be 1 mile of straight pavement.
Really?
Because that's where airplanes can land.
No kidding.
in the event of no kidding, we are under attack and we need a landing strip. There's going to be an interstate where every 5 miles. There's some exceptions if you're in the mountains and such.
Yeah,
right?
sure.
Planes aren't going to be trying to land.
I
But if you
hope
ever
not.
wondered why, when you're driving across Missouri or Nebraska, it's like, man, I could just put the steering wheel on hold and go forever. Well, that's why. And that was his vision, and he set the requirement, the expectation. Okay, Secretary of Transportation, go make that happen, and he did, and it changed the face of America.
It did.
One last thing is the chief of staff position.
Oh,
in modern politics, we hear about the chief of staff all the time. It's like the second most famous individual in the White House. Eisenhower creates that position as the chief of staff. Previously, presidents like Roosevelt and Truman, they had what they called a personal secretary, who essentially did the chief of staff's job. Yeah. But when Eisenhower shows up, he creates the position chief of staff, and every president since then has had a chief of staff, and that's directly imported from Eisenhower's military experience.
Fascinating. Yeah, one of the most important roles in the White House that keeps everything running. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So when Ike became president, he inherited a war in Korea. And there were some, like Douglas MacArthur, who you mentioned earlier, who advocated expanding the war, but Ike sought to end it quickly. Why was Ike keen to end that war, and why did he think the folks who wanted to expand it were wrong?
Getting Eisenhower to run for the presidency was a fairly long journey.
Yeah, it was.
One of Eisenhower's characteristics, going back a little bit in our conversation, was he was very ambitious. He was extremely ambitious. You have to be if you're going to reach that level. But it was kind of an understated ambition. In other words, he didn't wear it on his sleeve. For a long time, both parties are looking at Eisenhower saying, he'd be great. He'd be a great Democrat. Is he a Democrat?
Right.
I don't know. He'd be a great Republican. Is he a Republican? I don't know. No one could really pin him down. And he himself, comes to the decision to run for president fairly late I think it's early 1952. But I think he does it because he sees the war in Korea as an aberration of American foreign policy, and how the United States should respond in this new environment of the Cold War.
Sure.
As a supreme commander, we talked earlier about, he would risk the lives of his men for significant objectives, but he would not unnecessarily risk them. I think when he looked at Korea, he understood what was at stake, but it's 1952. The Korean War has been going on for 2 years, and the line, the battle lines are literally almost exactly where they were when the war started.
Yes.
So from Eisenhower's perspective, if you're going to go to war, if it's that serious that you're going to go to war and put American lives at risk, you have to fight to win. And MacArthur said the same thing, and other people said the same thing, but Eisenhower's coming at it from a different perspective in Korea, which is Europe is the primary theater of the conflict of the Cold War. Now, MacArthur disagreed. A lot of Republicans disagreed. There was some controversy about that. But from Eisenhower's view, and this is from when he was Supreme Allied Commander, and then he's the commander of NATO. He's the first commander of NATO. Yeah. He recognizes that if Europe goes down the toilet, it doesn't matter what happens in Korea.
Yeah.
So he's a Europe first kind of individual, and especially when he becomes president, that's where he believes the priority needs to be, and so the war in Korea needs to be wrapped up. I think he also saw Korea as a diversion of resources. Mm-hmm. We're expending a lot of treasure and blood in a theater where our stated objective is not to win. It's to gain an armistice, to reestablish the status quo, which is a positive objective. I mean, we do win Korea. A lot of people don't believe that, or they don't understand that, but we did get what we wanted to get.
Yeah, our objectives were realized.
Yeah, exactly.
Our objectives didn't include North Korea.
Exactly. But it took 3 years to do it, and 33,000, 37,000 American lives. It's like, okay, there has to be a more economical way to confront the Soviet Union. And by 1952, I think Eisenhower, he's kind of seeing, hey, we got what we wanted,
right?
And so let's wrap this up. So I think that's where he was coming from. Obviously, with MacArthur and even some of the commanders, Mark Clark, he's a supreme commander in Korea. Yeah. Mark Clark is kind of surprised when Eisenhower visits in December 1952, just after the election, that Eisenhower's not like, let's go, whoop on the North Koreans and the Chinese, because Eisenhower saw that the sooner the war ended, the better it would be under the conditions that obtained at the time.
Yeah. And I feel like that's really surprising to a lot of people that Eisenhower would have that opinion, because there's maybe a tendency to think a president who was a general is kind of like a guy with a hammer. If you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you were a general, you might think every problem needs a military solution. Yeah. So he winds on the Korean War. Where does he see that military tool fitting in his international tool belt?
Yeah. I think he would look at war as a necessary evil. Okay. It is a tool of last resort. I think a lot of this goes to his early childhood background. His father was of Mennonite descent, essentially a pacifist. Right. His mother was a Jehovah's Witness. So I think growing up, he really imbibed a lot of distaste for war and violence in general, which is like, okay, so why did you go to West Point?
Yeah, interesting profession choice. Yeah.
Yes, it is. So Eisenhower, that story, I can just tell it really briefly. He lives in Abilene, Kansas, and he is desperate to leave town. It's like, get me out of Abilene. And he knew his father's salary. They had six sons, a very, very poor family. He knew his father was already supporting one son at college. He knew he could not support another. So how do I get out of Kansas? And a friend of his said, hey, join the Naval Academy. They pay for your education for free. Eventually, he finds West Point and free education. It gets me out of Abilene.
Good deal.
He doesn't tell his parents, I think, until like the day before he leaves. It's a real shock to the family that he's going to do this.
Oh my
But
God.
he's off to West Point. But as a soldier,
Yeah.
he was always profoundly affected when he went to the battlefront.
Yeah.
And when he saw, this was D-Day. This was the cost to get to France, to break into Europe, to destroy the Nazi army, and it was a horrible cost. And so I think that yeah, if need be, we'll do it. We'll do World War III, but if we don't have to, he doesn't want to do that. And again, it goes back to what's America's principal power. It's economic might. It's industrial and economic might. We proved that in World War One. We proved it in World War Two. The Soviet Union bleeds the most in that war, but they stay in the war because the Americans send them trucks, cargo planes, food. All the logistics. Again, it's the logistics, right? They fought the fight, but we sustained them. And looking at Korea, I think Eisenhower sees the same thing. He goes to Korea in December. Yeah. Like I said, he shows very little enthusiasm for the American plan to, we're going to win the war with, a big attack. But he comes away very impressed with a Korean general named Pak Sun-yup. Huh. And Pak Sun-yup is briefing the president-elect and basically says, Mr. President-elect, if America gives us the guns, we will do the fighting. Eisenhower is like, right on. That's how it should be. Right?
Yeah.
People should be willing to defend themselves. And I think that's he sees that as being America's role in the Cold War is we will be the arsenal for democracy.
Yeah.
We will sustain and support other peoples to fight their own fights, right? Yeah. And in Korea, he saw firsthand the Koreans were in it. They were going to fight and defend themselves. When we fast forward to Vietnam, and I know we'll talk about Vietnam a little bit later.
It's up next, yeah.
it's not so much, and Eisenhower is really reluctant. How much commitment are we going to give to first French Indochina and then secondly South Vietnam before they demonstrate their will to fight for themselves?
And let's get into Vietnam, because he might not have started any new wars, but he did send military advisors to Vietnam. And building on everything you're just saying about how he thought of war and supporting allies and whatnot, what were these advisors doing, and what was Ike hoping to accomplish in Vietnam?
So the advisory mission actually begins with President Truman.
Oh, okay.
And it's a byproduct of the Korean War. When the North Koreans invade in 1950, suddenly there's this kind of opening up of Asia is in peril. Yeah. China's gone communist in 1949, right. And we kind of hoped that it would stay there. It was just kind of stop. And now Korea, Indochina, the French are having some issues there. So Truman extends some military aid to the French in Indochina. Well, one of the dirty secrets of military aid and assistance is you can send money, you can send stuff. Eventually, you've got to send people to administer the money and take care of the stuff.
Got it. Okay.
Right. So a lot of these advisors were advisors in a sense of they're technicians.
Yeah.
Right.
Got it.
So they're helping the French maintain the aircraft. After the French leave in 1955, I think it is, and we're supporting the Diem regime in South Vietnam. It's okay. Here's the rifles, the machine guns, the vehicles. This is how you take care of it. This is how you use it. People would be fascinated to know how much training it takes to drive an Army Jeep.
Yeah.
Right? Because we don't think about it. When my car needs oil, I drive to Valvoline, and they take care of everything. Yeah. Well, the Army doesn't have Valvoline. The Army has soldiers. Right. And the soldiers have to do the maintenance on the vehicle, and that's
all the vehicles.
It's a complicated thing, and right. So we had to send these advisors, technicians, whatever you want to call them, to help the French and then the South Vietnamese take care of their stuff, right? We sent advisors to, advise the South Vietnamese. This is how you run a country.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know. This is how you organize an army. This is how you run an army. This is how you train an army. So advisors are doing those kinds of things: organization, training, equipment maintenance, and stuff like that. The problem with an advisory mission is the people you're advising need to want your advice. In Korea, this worked out pretty well.
Okay.
And I think Eisenhower is looking at Korea as being a good model. I wrote my first book is about the American advisory mission to the Koreans, and that seems to work. It seemed to work out fine. Even now, 60 years later,
Right. Yeah.
70 years later, South Korea is doing pretty well, right? So Vietnam, we're not quite sure yet how that's going to work out, but Korea is the model, so we try to replicate that in Vietnam. But Eisenhower, I think, is a realist. He sees, by 1956-57 that politically he has to support South Vietnam in some way, and sending advisors. I think it's about 750 that are there by the time he leaves office. That's a cheap way to show support, political support, acknowledging legitimacy of the South Vietnamese government. But he's not sending troops. He's not sending combat troops.
That's right.
He draws the line at that. He's not an ideologue. Unfortunately, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, is. Okay. And it's really Dulles browbeats the Pentagon into supporting a advisory mission. The Army doesn't want to do it. The Joint Chiefs don't want to do it. The Secretary, the State Department wants to do it. And Eisenhower, about this time, 57, 58, Eisenhower gives a speech where he talks about the domino theory.
Right.
And I think he believes it. It makes sense to him that you have to stop the progress of communism somewhere.
Yeah.
But the domino theory is not the paradigm that he looks at the world. For Secretary of State Dulles, I think it is.
Interesting.
And so Dulles kind of refers to the domino theory as the plan of action. This needs to animate us, whereas Eisenhower is a little bit more reserved and wants to take it more slowly than other people would. But that's kind of how we get involved, and that's, I think, what Eisenhower was hoping to do, was to show political support,
but not get pulled in too deep.
But not get pulled in too deep, right?
So I'm curious, because Eisenhower lived until 1969. And I'm curious, do we have any sense of whether he agreed with JFK and LBJ's escalation of American involvement in Vietnam? And to put numbers there for context, there were fewer than 1,000 advisors or soldiers in Vietnam when Ike left office in 1961.
That's
there
right.
were around 16,000 when JFK was assassinated in 1963. And then there was the high watermark of roughly 540,000 or 500,000 around the time of Ike's death in 1969, which is also around the time LBJ was leaving office. So small involvement under Ike, bigger under JFK, and way bigger under LBJ. What did he think of what Vietnam was becoming?
Well, he was opposed to a major commitment of combat forces. I think he would have felt it was a diversion. It was wasteful. There's a lot of other ways to spend not only the money but also the manpower in the global contest against the Soviet Union. So it's not to say that he was not a cold warrior. He was. Right. He understood that we needed to confront the Soviet Union. But again, he believed that America's economic might was the best weapon, and he also recognized that it was a wasting asset if not carefully cultivated. Mm-hmm. And I think that he would have, or he actually did, say that this is a drain on our most valuable resource that is utterly ineffective.
Right.
Because the worst thing to fighting a colonial war is fighting somebody else's colonial war.
Right. Yeah.
And if we weren't going to go all in to save the French,
right,
when the French give defeat, why would we then take their place? It just makes no sense, from a foreign policy logic perspective. And then add to that, it's not only somebody else's colonial war; it's a guerrilla war.
Right.
So, somebody, and then here's Eisenhower. Here's President Eisenhower, the general, right, talking to his generals. Okay, generals, how do I know that we're winning?
Right.
How do I know when we've won?
Yeah.
Right. It could be 20 years. It could be 30 years before we even know that we've won the conflict. Right.
Yeah.
So that would have been completely, beyond what Eisenhower would have been willing to tolerate.
Do you think he would have wanted to cut bait and get out of Vietnam then, when it becomes clear it's either a lot of U.S. troops or you leave?
Yeah. This is, it's kind of an unfortunate instance where Eisenhower, he gets asked, people are talking to him, what should we do? And the advice he gives to LBJ is, well, you're in the war, you got to win. And Westmoreland says he needs X amount of men. Well, then, you probably need to give it to him.
Yeah.
But that's not the advice he wanted to give.
Yeah. So he would have rather not get that big, but
exactly.
By the time it is.
Exactly. By the time someone gets around to asking him his advice,
yeah.
the options are constrained, and that's, I think that's just kind of how he felt. Back to the World War II model.
Yeah.
Is we don't go after useless territorial objectives.
Right.
We economize on the lives of our men, but the best way to do that is win the war as soon as you can.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
That's true. So,
but it would have been. I think he probably would have been heartbroken.
Yeah.
Had he lived another 5 years or so and seen how the war actually ends.
Yeah. Ike also sent troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, when a white racist mob tried to block the integration of a public school there. And now I think we can all agree the cause was just to protect 9 African-American students who just wanted to go to school. But it must have been a heck of a decision to deploy U.S. troops on U.S. soil, potentially against U.S. civilians. Do we have any sense of how Ike weighed and made that decision?
Yeah. Eisenhower believed in the rule of law. Mm-hmm. And in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled, Brown versus the Board of Education, that that segregated schools was unconstitutional.
Right.
And Eisenhower, to him, this was very clear. whatever you think, whatever you think your loyalties are, or how you think the society should be constructed or the world should be, the Supreme Court of the land has said this is the law, and you need to follow it. Personally, Eisenhower favored, I think, a slow roll on civil rights, but only as a means to reduce tension. Right. I think it's clear that he recognized clearly the injustice of segregation. He knew black soldiers, very well from the war. He knew that they were, good, true Americans. When their country needed them, they responded. And I think that he was sympathetic to getting civil rights progress in America. But he's a realist, right? He's not an ideologue. He's a realist. He understood that there were going to be segments in the United States where this was going to be a hard pill to swallow. But again, falling back on his military experience, he likes to lead by consensus. Okay, personal engagement. So he brings Governor Fabus of Arkansas, has him come over, let me talk to this guy and try to get some consensus on how we can do this. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Your schools are going to integrate. how they integrate, Governor Phoebus, I'm willing to give you some opportunity to make this, less painful. Phoebus gives Ike the finger. He tells him to, take a hike.
Yeah.
We're not doing it. And so now Eisenhower's faced with a really easy decision. I have a duty to enforce the law.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to do it with overwhelming force.
Mm.
That's how you do it. That's how you solve. If the problem's a nail, I'm bringing the hammer, not my Nerf gun.
Right.
Right. And I'm not bringing my kids, play toy hammer. I'm bringing the sledgehammer.
Yeah.
So overwhelming display of power is of force. So some people in his cabinet wanted to send the marshals or send the FBI.
Sure.
Kind of they wanted it to be low key.
Right.
But Eisenhower is like, no, I want to send a message.
Yeah.
And he sends the 101st Airborne Division.
Amazing.
Which is like, okay, of all the soldiers, right,
Yeah.
that you could pick in the world, he picks the 101st, and I think that was deliberate.
Yeah.
There's the very famous photograph of him on June 5th talking to soldiers. They're all around, they're all surrounding him, and I think he's given them, the real story about some of you are not going to come back, but this needs to be done because we're going to destroy Nazi Germany.
Right.
And I think that he calls on this division again because he knows that this is so important that I need the optics of this division to be at the forefront of solving this problem.
Yeah.
Right. And remember, Ike's a good poker player.
Yeah.
He knows he's got the royal flush, and he knew that Phoebus had nothing because the other thing that Eisenhower does is he federalizes the Arkansas National Guard.
Right.
Right, and so this was something that Southern governors would do to kind of get around the rules. Is they would use, I got my Army troops, right? Well, when they get federalized, they're now working for Eisenhower. He's the commander in chief.
Yeah.
So he tells the Arkansas National Guard, okay, guys, go back to your barracks.
You go home. Yeah.
we got this, and so he really does kind of take. He takes whatever cards Phoebus thought he had and say, okay, chuck them because they're no good. Here's my royal flush, and
and the
people
poker play works.
Yeah, and people underestimated him.
Yeah,
and I think it's because they didn't see the ambition, they didn't see the resolve because, like I said, he had a very understated kind of public persona of being this nice guy. But the reality is that Ike was not shy about flexing muscle if he was sure that he was right. And in this case, he knew that he was, and he knew that duty required it. And his view, if I'm going to flex, I'm going to win.
right.
And that's why it's 101st that goes to Little Rock and does what they did.
In Eisenhower's farewell address, he famously warns to beware the military-industrial complex. Why did Eisenhower end with this message, and what did he mean by it?
This has stumped people for a long time, right? It goes back to, he's a general, he should love the Army. By the end of his tenure, the Army did not love Eisenhower.
Oh, drama.
Yes, because again, when money is your weapon system, his view was I need the most bang for my buck, and in the 1950s that meant atomic weapons. So the Air Force gets a lot of love when it comes to the Pentagon budgets, followed very closely by the Navy. Why? Because they can drop atomic bombs. The Army, not so much.
Right.
So the Army is getting the short end of the budgetary stick for several years in a row.
Yeah.
Until the late 50s, the Army figures this out, and they start putting atomic in front of every weapon system that they got. It's like, hey, we could do that too. It gets so ridiculous, Kenny, that the Army is creating atomic mortars So a mortar lobs a shell maybe 1,000 yards, 2,000 yards, and it's going to blow up, like
There's
Hiroshima.
nothing atomic about it.
It's like, that's really dumb, right? We had atomic backpacks that, the youngest lieutenant in the battalion would wear the backpack with the atomic bomb on it. It's like, it got crazy. But that's how desperate the Army was to get funding. Right?
Wow.
Yeah, in those years. So that's kind of just to set up what Eisenhower's gonna say.
Yeah.
Eisenhower had a tremendously varied background as a young officer. He was stationed in Texas, Pennsylvania, Washington D.C., Washington State, in Pennsylvania, and in Panama, and in the Philippine Islands. So he's seen a lot of America. He's seen some of America's overseas possessions, in the 1920s and 30s, and so he saw what American potential was, and I think it also gave him kind of a sensitive appreciation for Americans. Right? He did not want Americans to be a militarized people. He liked Americans as we were. Peaceable, hardworking, minding our own business, and building the American dream that I think that he saw and wanted that to extend to everybody. In the 1930s, he had an interesting job, which was to be responsible for industrial mobilization planning. This was something that in World War I, we kind of had to improvise until we figured out that we needed to centralize the industrial planning.
Yeah. How do you do a war economy to get all the
exactly
working? Basically.
Exactly. Well, in 1930, he's the guy tasked to the Great Depression has just started, and so the federal government's like, okay, how do we do this? Yeah. We don't run command economies. We just don't have any experience with this. So he's been put in charge of that, and so he knows industry, and he knows industry's potential to. I'm going to be indelicate. I'm going to say to fleece the American people through government contracts. Yeah, he understands that the potential that's there if it gets out of control, right? And then as the Supreme Commander, he obviously sees America's industrial might. Personally, I think he's a very frugal man. He grew up very poor. He went to college only because he found a free education, and like I said, living in the places that he lived, he saw that this was an American value, frugality, and not prodigality. And so I think in many ways, he wanted to preserve the America that he loved, and not militarize it and not saddle it with debt. And a militarized economy, or an economy that was reliant on military kinds of production, right?
Right.
Because he saw how easily that could seduce political figures, whether
Absolutely.
it's in fascist Italy, fascist Germany, right? Yeah. And he understood, government spending. There was a role for government spending. Building the highways is one of them, right? But if left unchecked, if no one's kind of minding the store, there's always going to be some industry or entrepreneur who says, "Hey, give me $1 billion and I can do this," right? Well, as a congressman once famously said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon it starts to add up to real money. And, right, and if you're frugal, and you're spending real money, then what does that mean? You got to tax real money, right? Yeah. You got to put a financial burden on Americans, and Eisenhower doesn't want to do that. So I think it's a long answer, but I think that all those, it's a multifaceted portrait that we get of Eisenhower as he's talking about the dangers of a military-industrial complex. It was not a knee-jerk kind of reaction.
Right.
This was something that he felt really deeply, and coming out of the presidency, he realized that this is potentially a problem.
The last question I have for you is, what lessons in leadership can we learn from Eisenhower?
Great question. I'm glad you saved it for last. I think that as we look at Eisenhower's his whole life and what he did, as an officer and president, we learn that self preparation is crucial. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to study the problem. You have to be well read, well versed. Eisenhower, kind of unusually when he's president, he does a lot of his own diplomacy. And he meets with Khrushchev, he meets with de Gaulle, he meets with Churchill, he meets with all these people, right? Yeah. And to do that and to do it effectively, you got to do your homework, right? And so he was very, very good at that, at self preparation, and it allowed him to he could study the problem, he could go through the planning process, which he realized was essential, and have a plan. And then when that plan of engagement, there's more than one meeting that he goes to with Khrushchev that it just blows up. It's like, oh wow, that's not gonna work. But what's plan B? What preparation did I do that? Okay, I'm not talking to Khrushchev, but I'm gonna go to Paris and I'm gonna see de Gaulle, and then I'm gonna go. He was able to be flexible and take advantage of opportunities. I think secondly, a lesson is to say what you mean and then mean it. Mm-hmm. Say what you mean and mean it. And that's when talking to an adversary or when talking to a friend. He and George Patton were friends for a long, long time after World War I in particular. They spent a lot of time together. They had a lot of respect for each other. When World War II came around, that relationship was tested on a number of levels, many times, and Eisenhower had to have more than one very frank conversation with George Patton, acknowledging Patton's undeniable gifts as a military leader, right? But also telling him, Georgie, he called him Georgie, you got to keep your mouth shut. Yeah. And this is the last time I'm going to tell you to keep your mouth shut. Yeah. That's so and again, this is probably the poker part. Who knows if Eisenhower would have followed through on the threat? Right. It doesn't matter. It only matters that Patton thought that Eisenhower would follow through on that threat. Yeah. So you have to say what you mean and mean it, and then be willing to follow through. Third, pick good people that you can trust, and then trust them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. More than one president, I think, has kind of run afoul of this principle, picking people that are not necessarily trustworthy, but it's your brother-in-law or it's your cousin or whatever. Right. Whatever reasons you might have for picking them, they're not usually good reasons. Ulysses S. Grant, the other president that West Point gets to claim, phenomenal general. His presidency was a disaster in many respects because he just could not. He was a terrible poker player, and he just could not pick good people, and he was easily bluffed, by people, who would say that, oh, you can trust me, and no, they were in it. They were in it for themselves. Yeah. So you have to be able to. You got to be able to read people. Yeah. And pick people you can trust, and then you got to trust them to actually to do what you want them to do. It doesn't do any good to have a lot of trust in somebody and never actually invest trust in them to do something. Right, and then babysit them the whole time. Yeah, exactly. So the ability to delegate was really important, and he was really good at that, both as a military commander and as president. Again, that's probably one of the ways that this idea that he was not a hands-on kind of president comes about, that he does delegate a lot of stuff, and it's like, I don't come talk to me until A, you're done, or B, you've run into an insurmountable problem that you can't figure out on your own. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they would go and they would do what needed to be done. And then lastly, I think it's be more than you appear. Focus on deeds and not words. Like I said before, Eisenhower an understated presence. It was easy to underestimate him. until he went into action. And he didn't just talk, try to talk his way out of problems. He comes under tremendous criticism in the Mediterranean in 1943 and in Northwest Europe in 1944. And he doesn't spend any time engaging in that criticism. It's more like, okay, watch. If you're if you're so wrapped around the axle by what you think I'm doing or not doing, watch for my results. So let's count them off. Operation Torch, the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that time, a success. The Allies actually get on the continent. People are like, wow, that was amazing.
Yeah.
I can't believe we actually did that, right?
Yeah, that's
in
not
fact,
like crossing the Channel to France. That's a big,
right,
around Spain
right.
and everything over there. Yeah,
huge coordination to. Ships are coming from South Carolina. They're coming
right.
from England. They're coming from all over the place to all land at the same spot at the same time, right? Now, this kind of worked against them. There was so much relief that we actually did it that they kind of forgot. They forgot to fight the Germans, right?
Right.
So the campaign to capture Tunisia takes a while.
It does,
but it's a success, right? Yeah. So when everyone's thinking, oh man, I don't think Eisenhower can pull it off, he does. He wins. And then you go to Sicily, an even larger amphibious attack in the number of troops that are involved on the first day. Right? In 39 days, the island is conquered. And there's some criticism about, well, you should have had this person do this or whatever. But hey, right. Sicily's taken out. Right? The Italians surrender to Eisenhower.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, and then he sends forces into Italy to make sure that the Italians stay surrendered. Right, and we have a very long campaign in Italy, but he knocks out.
Come in. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But he knocks out the Italians.
Right.
So he's operating at a diplomatic level. He's operating at a military level. He's operating at a leadership level. And then you go to Northwest Europe. Obviously, Operation Overlord, the Normandy landings. The day before, when there's a famous incident about the weather. Right. It's not looking good. They've already postponed the invasion, once, and the weather guy says, "Okay, sir, I think we're going to have about 12 to 18 hours, but I think."
Right.
Right. I can't give an assurance. I think, and Eisenhower kind of goes around the room and he starts asking, and people are like, no, don't go. No, don't go. No, don't go. Montgomery says, yes, go. Some more no's. But ultimately it's Eisenhower's decision, and right. He decides that they're going to go.
Yeah.
Right after that decision, he goes back to his office and gets a piece of paper and a pencil, and he writes down a note that if the invasion fails, this is what his statement is going to be.
Right.
And, he basically says that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen did all that was asked of them.
Right.
If there's any blame, it's mine.
Yeah.
Which I mean, that's incredible. I'm getting emotional talking about this because I can't imagine the weight that he must have felt knowing that I'm about to send 2 million Canadians, British, Americans. Not to mention the French that are going to be in the line of fire.
Yeah.
Right? This is the mighty endeavor, the great crusade.
We've been working for this for 2 years.
Right,
or more,
right.
Really,
Or more, yeah. And because I said, let's go, this is really, really incredible. So, it's deeds. It's not words. It's what you actually do that you should judge somebody and not what they say.
If you've enjoyed this interview with Bryan and you want to hear more from him, he's got some books out there. His most recent is Korean Showdown, National Policy and Military Strategy in a Limited War, 1951 to 1952. That sounds really interesting. I'm very intrigued by that title.
Good.
Thank you so much for your time, Bryan.
Hey, you're welcome, Kenny. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, on November 20th, I will drop 2 episodes of Abridged Presidential Histories. The first is a special Friendsgiving History Podcasting Spectacular featuring a presidential history roundtable with our friends Jerry Landry of Presidencies of the United States, Howard Dory of Plodding Through the Presidents, and Alicia of Civics and Coffee. It's a really fun conversation. You will enjoy it. And I will also drop my narrative episode on John F. Kennedy and explore what is real and what is hidden by the myth of Camelot. That's coming up next on Abridged Presidential Histories.